Hello, my name is Makeda Barr-Brown, and I am submitting my Ben talk for the 2019 BFS class. So the most intriguing research that I've done while at Penn has been my senior thesis paper for the International Relations Department. My paper is on South African presidential human rights rhetoric after the end of apartheid. And I was interested in doing my senior thesis on something related to South Africa after studying abroad at the University of Cape Town in the fall of my junior year. At UCT, I was taking all of my courses in politics and history, and it really gave me some insight into the complexities of South African politics and history. What was even more meaningful for me was that I was able to have conversations with South African students about their perspectives on the political climate in South Africa. And it was especially meaningful because UCT students are known for being particularly politically active. So they had a lot of opinions on the government and a lot of opinions on how the government's transformed after South Africa became a democracy. So I gained a lot of insight into South African opinions on their own country, which was really amazing. And what struck me the most was that there were so many South African students around my age who did not see Mandela in a positive light. There were multiple students who called him a sellout and thought he was too passive during his presidency and set up the future corruption and missteps within the ANC. And this shocked me because Nelson Mandela is so revered within the Western world and as a human rights icon that I couldn't imagine anyone disliking him. So after many different versions of my thesis, I ended up settling on the research question of how has the human rights rhetoric of South African presidents changed in each administration from Nelson Mandela to Jacob Zuma? Why study rhetoric and why not just study legislation and policy that was passed for each administration? I find that policy documents do not always represent like the true thoughts of a leader. And of course, it can be argued, presidents don't write their own speeches. So speeches don't accurately represent their feelings either, but I still think it's a more accurate way to understand the motives of a leader than through studying policy. And also, presidents don't always have the ability to change policy directly, so policy documents may represent the majority of the party's opinion, but not the president's, especially in a parliamentary democracy like in South Africa. I also think that rhetoric is an extremely powerful tool that can be used to influence large groups of people when on a large enough platform. And the power of rhetoric can be seen in the rise in power for various dictators and other nationalist governments. The power of words and their delivery can change the mindset of entire populations and change the way that they see themselves and their national identities. And because of this, I thought it would be beneficial to study rhetoric in South Africa. So I decided to do a qualitative content analysis using speeches from Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki, and Jacob Zuma during their presidencies. I reviewed each speech using variables that indicated the human rights content of the speech, as well as the audience that the speech was being made to. And I made sure to search terms like human rights, corruption, which I found through my literature review, like corrupt governments are more likely to be violating human rights too. I looked up terms like discrimination, nationalism, African unity, and many, many others in order to categorize my speeches. I ended up coming up with three main hypotheses that I kind of based the rest of my analysis on. The first one is that the frequency and volume of human rights rhetoric will decrease after the end of Nelson Mandela's presidency because the focus of the subsequent administrations shifted from human rights to the economy, nationalism, and differentiating South Africa from the West. The second hypothesis is that there will be an increase in rhetoric promoting the economy, nationalism, and differentiating South African identity from the Western identity, which is indicative of a greater trend in BRICS nations. And then my final hypothesis is that based on presidential rhetoric, South Africa is less willing to be a regional hegemon in Africa than it was during Nelson Mandela's presidency, because the more recent administrations wanted to distance themselves from the Western agenda. And this one is based off of the notion that they would be a regional hegemon as like a mouthpiece for the West. So after conducting my own research, I found that my hypotheses were relatively accurate. Nelson Mandela definitely focused most of his rhetoric on human rights related issues because it was the main pillar of his foreign policy. Mbeki definitely focused more on African unity and differentiating South Africa from the West, and he focused a lot on South to South cooperation and investment, while Jacob Zuma did not seem to express any clear foreign policy goals or any clear rhetoric on human rights. A lot of his speeches were very generic in that they kind of just regurgitated something that Mandela said years ago, or I kind of I kind of want to call him like a ribbon cutting president. Like he made a lot of speeches at like ceremonies for holidays and openings of things, and less speeches about what South Africa is doing on the international stage and how they want to change or maintain their image, and how they want to, evolve as a nation. I think that Mbeki is definitely more academic and detailed. He quotes a lot of academics in his speeches, and he's very long-winded. But he also is susceptible to believing in conspiracy theories, and the biggest one being his view that the HIV virus does not cause AIDS, which directly led to the lack of care for thousands of people affected by the disease. So, a direct violation of someone's human right, their right to life. So Mbeki definitely, in his speeches, he definitely lacked that human factor that like Mandela is so well known for. While Zuma seems like at the beginning of his presidency, he was trying to embody the spirit of Mandela, but he ended up being so tied down by his own corruption scandals, his various votes of no confidence, his rape trial, that he didn't really have time to talk about, or he didn't want to talk about human rights or really anything else besides his own problems. My thesis definitely adds more literature to the already existing work on political rhetoric and more generally on human rights, especially regarding BRICS nations. It's also practically significant in understanding how BRICS nations, and specifically South Africa, approach human rights violations on an international and domestic level. And more generally, my thesis has a greater significance of how rapidly developing and increasingly powerful nations approach human rights issues compared to the West, especially nations that are trying to distance themselves from the Western hegemony. So this has definitely been the most challenging project that I've had to work on while at Penn. It's required more time than anything else, but it's given me a lot of insight into how to do research and how to tailor the research to make it something that I enjoy. I find this topic really interesting. I enjoy talking about South African politics, and I enjoy listening to what leaders say and trying to understand them on an individual level and how that affects their actions as president. So being able to explore, this topic that I find so interesting was really amazing, and it's given me a whole new breadth of knowledge that I never could have imagined having without having to do this thesis. So thank you. And I have enjoyed being a BFS scholar, and I think that it's really helped me be able to do a project like this, to be able to, do the research, use the resources that have been available to me. So thank you.